Hello and welcome to the Expanse. I'm the Quack and I hope you're having less quack day than myself. This is Ramblings of a Mad Duck. Afterlives Ardenweald. So I guess to state the obvious, this one was sad, to say the very least. We literally just watched Ursoc die for the greater good, which was tragic to say the very least. And what's even sadder is I'm pretty sure Ursoc didn't go to Ardenweald when he died, as in he was consumed by Legion, meaning the Bear Lords of Azeroth are now officially dead. A loss to say the very least. There is the possibility that there is still a part of Ursoc still around, as a part did go to the Emerald Dream. However, it's arguable whether he went there after being to the Dream, or whether his soul was split similar to Uther, which is actually a question this entire animatic raises, which is the idea, do spirits of nature kind of split? As in, does one part go to Ardenweald and another part go to the Dream, or does it just travel from one to another? So from the Dream to Ardenweald, and the Ardenweald to the Dream, and then back to reality. What I am also curious about is whether this kind of proves Ardenweald is kind of a hub for nature spirits, and whether the Emerald Dream is one of many dreams. As in, well, yeah, all spirits go to Ardenweald for their winter, so they can kind of like rejuvenate and reincarnate. Then they kind of go through the Emerald Dream to kind of come back into existence, or the equivalent of the Emerald Dream on their planet to come back into existence. Which, interestingly enough, might explain why the old gods were so interested in the Dream to begin with, or why the Dream has been such a target for corruption to begin with. Because if new life does start there, or if life comes there to kind of get a new beginning, and or just return to where it came from, then it's basically the perfect medium to take souls and stop them from, well, going to where they're supposed to go. Or at the very least stopping nature souls from going where they're supposed to go. Which also raises another question about whether there are other types of, well, realms and processes for other types of spirits or beings, like demons, Titanforged, blah 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 blah, you know. Actually, Titanforge probably have that process, considering Odin Halls of Valor, or at least he created a version of it, but anyway. Raises a few interesting questions. Now, speaking of the nightmare, the fact Ursoc didn't bring the nightmare with him when he went to Ardenweald creates a lot of very interesting questions about Ysera. And, well, how would I put it? Killing her once was bad. Killing her twice? That's just... that's going to be another level of depressing, to say the very least. And the reason why I'm convinced of this is because, as most people have kind of, well, found out because it's been reported on, the Infiltration Manifesto, the one that kind of goes over how it seems that the Venthyr / Natherzim / Dreadlords in general seem to have infiltrated all of the magics in general, to their own end to sow chaos, etc, etc. In that manifesto, it mentions that there is an agent for the Natherzim within life. We just don't know who it is. This animatic, at least for me, solidifies two possibilities. The first possibility, which was suggested to me by Baalsamael, was the possibility that Moonberry, the fairy that helps players along in Ardenweald, is the traitor and the person who infiltrated Ardenweald for the Natherzim. The reason why, as he aptly points out, is that of all of the Court of Night, as in the Winter Queen's inner circle in general, she does not fit. As in, he mentions that she's not a Droman, which is strange. She isn't a part of the Wild Hunt, but she is still a part of the Court of Night. The question is, how does somebody with a lack of, I guess, status in general end up as a part of the Winter Queen's inner circle? He also aptly points out that Moonberry is the one that shows us to Ysera's Wild Seed, which is very strange because it's carrying the nightmare, which shouldn't have happened, assuming we saw all the important parts of Ursoc's time in Ardenweald. The second option, and the option that I think is more likely, and once again, is why I mentioned the possibility of killing Ysera again, is that the person they're referring to in that manifesto is Ysera. As yes, the book is incredibly old. That is not an understatement, to say the very least. And overall it kind of disproves this possibility being a thing. But taking into the possibility that parts of this manifesto / book was written I'm just going to say book from now on, were written at different times, here is how that possibility would make sense. When Ysera is seemingly taken by Elune and eventually placed in Ardenweald, something that's rather interesting is that the tier of Elune specifically is cleansed. Now, when Xavier's corrupted Ysera, the seed was quite thoroughly corrupt, and after everything that occurs, it's cleansed by Elune. Now, the question is, when Elune cleansed the tier, where did the corruption go? As in, did it outright just disappear? Or in a more, quite possibly twisted sense, did the corruption go with Ysera? As in, the reason why Elune interfered with Ysera to begin with wasn't because of everything she had done, but instead because she knew we needed the tier of Elune to kind of save Azeroth. Now, I will admit, where I am painting Elune as the bad guy, the setup for this is actually pretty brilliant. Because by all accounts, this would imply that the Natherzim basically put Elune between a rock and a hard place. Now, what I mean by that is, everybody knows about Archimonde's seeming connection to the Nightmare at the end of WoD, which was just strange to begin with. But when we consider all the information we have now, it actually makes a considerable amount of sense why Archimonde may have been toying with the Emerald Nightmare, if he was in on the Jailer's plan, or at least if he knew something about the Jailer that either Sargeras didn't, or he had been ordered to do something on Sargeras' behalf for the Jailer. And what's interesting is that this actually adds context to what's also mentioned in the book about lies being given to the Shadow. Because something everybody kind of noticed about N'Zoth and the Emerald Dream and everything that kind of happened there was, it kind of ended too quickly and too easily, as in we kind of went in, cleansed the place, the end, GG. Nothing major really happened, and overall we kind of finished it in one scenario. Now for N'Zoth and everything that we've kind of gone through, this was a significant loss, as in the amount of time and effort put into putting the seed there for it to then be rather quickly removed doesn't seem to add up. But when you consider the possibility that Elune had to choose between sending a corrupted Ysera to Ardenweald versus leaving the tier of Elune corrupted, which we explicitly needed to close the portal that the demons were using to get into Azeroth during 8.2, things start to make a bit more sense. As in, the reason why the Emerald Nightmare kicked off during the Legion invasion was because the Natherzim were basically pulling out all the stops, as in their whole goal at that point, and maybe it was just Sargeras' goal overall at that point, was to get the Jailer out of the Maw, or was basically using all of his assets in relation to the Jailer to invade Azeroth this time round. Either way, the overall implication here seems to be that the Natherzim specifically wanted Ysera and the Nightmare in Ardenweald. Now, why is this the case? Well, overall it's basically as the Infiltration book implies. They wanted someone to get close to the Winter Queen, or their quote-unquote target. And what's rather interesting is that it never explicitly says who the target is. The assumption is it's the Winter Queen. However, from a few of the beta playthroughs I have been able to see, it seems as if Ysera specifically befriends a bear from another world that specifically fought the Legion. So it will be very interesting to see if Ysera is a traitor or being used in some form, if that bear somehow falls into that plan. Because the one thing about the Bear Lords that's very interesting is that of all the creatures in Ardenweald, I get the impression the bears are arguably the strongest and most ferocious and hardest to generally deal with. So if a bear spirit did fall to any form of influence or corruption on the part of the Jailer or the Natherzim, it's quite possible they could cause a lot of destruction. Now that's the first possibility on why Ysera may be the Infiltrator. The second reason goes back to some very old, at this point, and interesting lore that hasn't actually been touched on in quite a while. And that is, during the Sunwell, we fight Caligos. And the reason we fight Caligos is because he is quite literally possessed by an Natherzim, as in dragons seem to have the ability to be possessed by, well, Dreadlords. And basically throughout the entire fight we have to beat the living crap out of Caligos' body, then seemingly go into his mind to kick out the Natherzim. Now, I will admit, Caligos at this point was not an aspect, but he was a dragon, So assuming this is just something the Natherzim can do to dragons overall, and we take into consideration the possibility Loom was left between a rock and a hard place, it's actually quite possible that Ysera is being controlled, dominated, or is generally trying to fight off a Dreadlord's control at this very moment, and we just generally don't know at all. And at any point in time, there could be a switch flicked, which basically turns Ysera on us. So assuming this possibility is actually happening, there is a very real chance this animac has just hinted at the very real possibility of who is the infiltrator within Ardenweald. Moving on, this animac implies a very significant thing about how time works in the Shadowlands. As in, time definitely does act differently in the Shadowlands, however, from everything that happened in relation to Ursoc and how seemingly time passed incredibly quickly from when he arrived in Ardenweald to when he died, as in Arwen mentions that seasons of drought have occurred over the course of Ursoc being there. So it seems as if time is faster in the Shadowlands, and overall is accelerated in comparison to the physical universe. So basically, 1 minute in the physical universe could possibly equal a year in the Shadowlands. Meaning overall, instead of a time skip occurring during the Shadowlands, there's a very real possibility that when we walk out, we're just going to be a lot older than we were when we walked in. So anyway, we beat Ursoc in the Emerald Nightmare raid, which happened at the end of the initial content of Legion. Meaning for Ursoc's soul to end up in the Shadowlands means death had to have broken after that time. Meaning 7.1 through to 7.3 is the likely time period that death broke. Now the question becomes, what event could have caused that? Was it the Legion messing around with Karazhan? Was it 7.1 and something to do with what Gul'dan was doing on top of the Nighthold, and possibly something he saw? Was it Argus being pulled into the sky? Was it the impaling of Azeroth? At present, the most obvious possibility is that it was when the sword got impaled into Azeroth. That's like the most obvious possibility, and could possibly explain why Azerite was activated to begin with. And what I mean by that is Azerite, prior to Sargeras stabbing his sword into the planet, didn't actually look like Azerite, as in the top of Galliwix's cane changed colour to the colour of Azerite, seemingly after the sword had stabbed Azeroth. And so the implication might be that, well, the anima that would usually go to the Shadowlands had started to instead permeate Azeroth as a whole, in turn activating Azerite. Kind of like a chemical reaction, because the way they've kind of described anima, or at least from memory, the way I remember anima being described is that it was kind of equated to like oxygen, and the idea that it was just basically everywhere in the Shadowlands prior to the drought, as in everything was infused with it. It was basically like air, and you're just generally breathing it. So what I'm basically getting at here is that air instead got transplanted to Azeroth because of the sword, and the anima activated Azerite, or at the very least it interacted with certain materials on Azeroth and created Azerite. That's the most obvious option. I personally lean more towards the idea that it may have happened during 7.2, specifically when Illidan pulled Argus into the sky. And the reason why is that, for those who have watched, which one was it? It was The True Enemy of All, The Damned. If you watch that theory, you know I basically constructed this theory that death was in some way related to fate, and the idea that the inevitable fate of everything is to die. And the notion of true death, the darkness, just in general, the genuine evil of World of Warcraft, related to the idea that there was something that wanted to bring about the inevitable fate of everything, which is death in general. So basically, in one way, shape, or form, death equaled fate, and everything else kind of equaled destiny in some way, shape, or form. I'll leave a link to the theory in the description. What I'm describing makes a lot more sense in the theory. But anyway, what's interesting is just before Illidan pulled Argus to Azeroth, he mentions that sometimes the hand of fate must be forced. On top of this, in 7.1, you also had Medivh, who came out of nowhere basically mentioning the bonds of fate as a concept. Now, it would be very interesting if Illidan had some knowledge of the Jailer, or at least thought something else was going on, hence why he mentioned fate, and hence why he brought Argus to Azeroth. As in, he kind of knew, yes, the Legion's bad, or at least in his eyes, he knew the Legion was bad, and Sargeras was his only target. But at the same time, he also knew there were other things possibly playing into the Legion's entire scheme, which, from memory, and I might be wrong, might actually explain what he left for us, and possibly Malfurion and Tyrande as well, as in the message he says to us and how we have to remain vigilant of new threats. What is interesting though is that if it does have something to do with 7.2 and everything that went on inside the tomb of Sargeras, it might actually explain Kil'jaeden's words in relation to, well, what he was talking about in relation to the Titan facility, as in the Temple of Elune itself, as in we basically didn't know what we were standing on and that it was a lot more important than we realized. And speaking of Kil'jaeden, it would also line up rather nicely if his death was one of the catalysts, or at least lined up with the breaking of death overall. And the reason why is because, as I mentioned in Natherzim Conspiracy, I generally think he was either heavily used by the jailer or was 100% in on the jailer's plans, hence his very strange entrance during the Sunwell, which partially made no sense because it seemed to imply that he wanted to overthrow Sargeras. But considering everything we know, that kind of makes little to no sense as to how he could have done so, unless he was planning to use the jailer's power or the influence that the jailer had. And because I've gone to 7.2 and mentioned Natherzim Conspiracy, I should probably also mention 7.1, and Gul'dan possibly being the reason why Death broke. And the reason why is because we still have no clue what he saw. And once again, if you watch Natherzim Conspiracy, well, yeah, there is a possibility that he was entirely manipulated by the jailer throughout his entire life. And so there is a very real possibility that everything he was doing on top of the Nighthold was in part, at the very least, on behalf of the jailer, as he does mention that Death will inherit this world, but to our knowledge, unless you go digging incredibly deep, there are no overt connections connecting Gul'dan to the Maw, or the jailer. Okay, so moving on some more. The Night Fae of Ardenweald definitely, 100% look like satyrs. They is a flat given. And because of this, it raises a general question about Xavius and what Sargeras actually did to him. Because the established lore generally goes out of its way to say Xavius was the first of the satyrs. However, with Ardenweald and basically this one still from this animatic, it seems as if Xavius wasn't the first, but most likely the first on Azeroth, and was possibly, if we're going to keep with the idea of him being the first, might have been the first fully corrupted version of a Satyr, which honestly I doubt, because I wouldn't be surprised if the Satyr came first and Night Fae came second. So overall, the implication would be that, yeah, Xavius was the first corrupted and or just general Satyr, which is a corrupted version of a Night Fae or a dark version of a Night Fae on Azeroth. And yes, over time he definitely changed, hence why he looks the way he does in the Emerald Nightmare raid, but overall the similarities are quite uncanny. What this does do, however, is raise an interesting question about Xavius' origins and what he was kind of doing the entire time, because it was Xavius who kind of helped convince Zajara to bring the Legion to Azeroth. And the general assumption has been, for a relatively long time, and I feel like a reasonably long time, that Xavius was an agent of the Old Gods. And so the idea was that it was the Old Gods that kind of wanted the Legion on Azeroth and, you know, etc, etc. But this whole possibility of Satyrs being related to the Legion, and Xavius being turned into a Satyr and then eventually ending up as a tree, spreading the nightmare to Teldrassil, etc, etc, all seems to imply that he may have been convinced Sargeras was a god and basically convinced overall to bring Sargeras to Azeroth because he somehow got influenced by the jailer in life, which ties ancient night elves to the jailer, but that's another theory for another time because, wow, that's a big topic to say the very least. Something that I thought was a very nice touch on Blizzard's part was how the staves of the Night Fae are basically dream catchers. And the reason why I'm finding this to be a very, very cool and interesting detail is that dream catchers aren't solely a Night Fae thing. They're actually a thing that the Arakoa practice with, as in the Outcasts and the Arakoa proper, or at least the adherents, both use dream catchers, and you kind of get an explanation as to what they kind of do within Arakoan culture through archaeology in WoD. What is rather interesting about the adherent dream catchers, or at least their buildings that look like massive dream catchers, is that the center of their dream catchers are specifically the sun. As in, that's kind of how they design them, as in the center of the Arakoan Dreamcatcher is the sun. which at the very least should make you wonder about, well, I guess, Rookmar and generally just this whole sun motif and what the sun does in relation to souls and how it kind of gathers them in general. And what adds to this rather nicely is the fact that dream catchers are also a big thing in Tauren culture. As in, when you find a Tauren building, it's rare that you won't find a dream catcher either inside, on the outside, or generally just in the vicinity of a Tauren building. And once again, these dream catchers are specifically designed to catch spirits. As in, I'm pretty sure the Tauren dream catchers are designed to catch like dark spirits, and once again the adherent and outcast dream catchers do similar things just for different reasons. But overall, the fact that Nightface staffs basically have dream catchers on the end is a nice touch in relation to the overall lore of World of Warcraft, and adds a bit of consistency in relation to what certain objects / items / things do in relation to World of Warcraft. As in dream catchers, or if you see something that looks like a dream catcher, it is specifically designed to catch souls. And I guess the other interesting thing is that, yeah, it's a dream catcher, and with the Emerald Dream and Ardenweald being connected to each other, it kind of adds to the idea that Ardenweald is, I guess, the soul catchment for nature, or nature spirits in general, as in it catches nature souls before they go, well, somewhere else, I guess. So overall, Afterlives Ardenweald is, well, sad, but also very, very intriguing, and adds some very interesting context and leads to some very interesting speculation that, well, yeah, similar to the other animatics, sets up a lot of very interesting possibilities. Thank you for listening. Oh yeah, and about this infiltration book. Other than what I've mentioned in this ramble, I'm probably not going to make any dedicated content on it. Why? Well, for those who have watched Natherzim Conspiracy, I don't really need to say anything else. And for those that haven't, a comment that recently appeared on Natherzim Conspiracy, which I personally thought was rather hilarious, was the accusation that I worked for Blizzard. I wish I did, but I don't. But as a commentary on the theory as a whole, once again, enough said. Link will be in the description.